Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to learn about a principle today that I love. It is a I gotta say, highly formalistic principle in Halakha called Kol Haroi Labila Ein Bila Ma'akevet Bo. Literally translated, if it is viable for mixing, mixing is not strictly necessary. And the rest of the comment is, or the rest of the idiom is B'kol she'ein roi lebila bila ma'akevet bo. And anything that is not viable for mixing, mixing is strictly required for it. Now, this is a concept that comes up in Menachot already on Daf Yud Chet Amud Bet 18b, but it's locus classicus, the place where it gets its original real traction, is Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Bet in Menachot, based on a Mishnah. We'll go over it in a minute. But it is a concept that shows up in different places in Shas. The idea that potential is enough. You don't actually have to do the action. The potential for the action, the viability for the action to be done is good enough. The reason why I love this concept is because it plays off of the creativity of Jewish law, the creativity of Halakha. There's a whole machloket, there's a whole argument over to what degree does law reflect reality, and to what degree does law create reality. It's called the argument between realism and nominalism. Realism is law is responding to and reflecting reality, and nominalism is law creates reality. And I think that on that scale between realism and nominalism, Kol hara'ui lebila ein bila ma'akevet bo, the idea that something, the viability to be able to be mixed is what's necessary and not the actual mixing itself, is a very nominalistic concept. It's abstract, it's creative, it's actually quite sophisticated. So I love it. And the first way that I learned about it is actually in the halachot of immersing in a mikvah, because when a person immerses in a mikvah, they do not have to open their mouth in the mikvah, even though, in theory, the water should get to every part of the body. But even though they don't have to open their mouth, and I would add, you shouldn't open your mouth in the mikvah, you have to make sure that you don't have any chatzitzot, you don't have anything that divides between the inside of your mouth and water if it had theoretically gotten in there, because of this concept. The inside of your mouth has to be viable, that if it were to come into contact with water, there would be no chatzitza, no dividing object, no foreign object there. But lema'aseh, practically speaking, you don't actually have to open your mouth. It's just the viability that is needed and not the actual contact with the water. So kol hara'ui lebila, to me, it's very exciting to actually learn the makor for it, the actual source for it, when many people live this concept. It's the reason why people floss their teeth before they go in the mikvah, even though their mouth is going to be closed, right? People live this concept all the time. So let's dig in. I want to look at a few examples where it comes up, and then I want to understand the concept. Okay? So let's start with our Gemara. Moment. Let's start with our Gemara. Okay? So our Gemara has Rabbi Zera. This is Rabbi Zera's ruling. Now, it's funny because Rabbi Zera has a few rulings in Shas that end up getting quoted. And Rabbi Zera says this, Rabbi Zera says that. But it's really here. Kol haroi lebila ein bila ma'akevet bo. Anything that is viable, meaning if the situation is such that there is a viability of mixing the flour in the korban mincha and the shemen, the oil in the korban mincha, you don't actually have to mix. There just has to be a viability that you could mix. But if there is no viability of mixing, we say, well, The mixing is ma'akev. The mixing undermines, if you don't do it, it undermines the korban, and you have to do it. But look there, you can't do it. So the korban is actually going to be invalid. But where it comes from is a Mishnah in Menachot, an explanation of a Mishnah in Menachot on Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Bet. And it describes mitnadev adam mincha shel shishim isaron umevi b'kli echad. A person can offer a korban mincha that is as big as 60 esronim, okay? Tenths of an ephah of fine flour, okay? And you can bring them all in one kli, in one vessel, okay? But im amar hare al alai shishim ve'echad, if somebody says, I want to bring 61 esronim, mevi shishim b'kli echad ve'echad b'kli echad. You bring 60 in one vessel, and it's going to have to be a separate korban mincha for the next one isaron in another vessel. Why? So the first explanation in the Mishnah is sheken hatzibur mevi biyom tov harishon shel chag shechal liot b'shabbat shishim ve'echad. Because if you look, if the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, you end up giving 61 esronim, basically adding together all of the korbanot of Sukkot, plus, meaning of that day of Sukkot, because remember, you give a lot of parim, you give a lot of, a lot of cows, and Menachot come with those cows, plus the korban tamid of the day of the mincha that comes with it, plus the special korban musaf of Shabbos and the mincha that comes with that. So that all adds up to 61. And dayol yachid shehu pachot min hatzibur echad. You're an individual. We don't want you giving more than 60 at a time because we don't want you to outrank and outflank the greatest number of menachot that the tzibur, that the community gives in a day. So Rabbi Shimon says, that doesn't make sense. I'm Rabbi Shimon. What do you mean that tzibur gives a maximum of 61 and an individual should be less? Those are not all the same mincha. It's not 61 esronim of the same mincha. There's the mincha that goes with the cows. There's the mincha that goes with the lambs. Meaning these are separate minachot, right? They're not mixed up together. Ella, rather, what's the reason? Ad shishim yecholin libalel. Up to 60 esronim in a vessel, you can mix the oil and the flour. Amrulo, so they said to Rabbi Shimon, what do you mean? Why? Shishim is the magic number? Shishim nivlalim. 60 is the magic number, but shishim ve'echad ein nivlalim. If you add another tenth of an ephah, you can't mix it in that kli. Amr lahem. So Rabbi Shimon answers, Kol midot chachamim him. That's all measurements, all rabbinic measurements. If you have ba'arba'im sa'ah hu tovel, 40 sa'ah is what you need, 40 sa'ah of water in order to immerse, in order for something to be considered a mikvah. But uva arba'im sa'ah chaser kartov, eno yachol litbol ben. But if it's a teeny bit of water, you can't immerse in it. What's the difference between 39.9999998 and 40? The difference is, that's our measurement. That's it. So same thing here. 60 is the maximum where you can do what we call belila, or what's going to be called bila, okay? It's the maximum of where you can do belila. You can do the mixing in that kli of the oil and the flour. So the Gemara says, wait a second. Who cares if you can do belila or not? What's the big deal if you can't mix it? V'hatnan. Don't we have a Mishnah that says, Im lo balal kasher? Even if you don't do the mixing, that's fine. That's not ma'akiv. So Rabbi Zera says, nope, kol harai lebila. If it's a situation, namely maximum of 60 in a vessel, if it's a situation where you could, in theory, mix it, in bila ma'akevet bo. It's okay if you don't do b'diavad, after the fact, if you don't do the blila, if you don't do the mixing, it's fine. But but if it's not a situation where you could even potentially mix it, meaning there's just too much in there to be able to mix it together, then bila ma'akevet bo. Then if you don't do the mixture, then it's a problem. Hence up to 60, and that's it. And that's the origin. Now, when I mentioned the example of tevila, right, the example of immersion, where viability matters, it's right in the Gemara. The Gemara dinanddaf samach vav amud bet. Amar Rava, Rava says, L'olam Yelamed Adam betoch beito, a person should teach in their house. Shetehei isha medicha beit kmateha b'mayim, that a person, in order to prepare for the mikvah, they should rinse any place on the body that has creases, right? Think maybe underarms is a good example, right? And then the Gemara says, Meitvei, but wait, we have something that seems to undermine that. Beit hakmatim u'beit hastarim enam tzrichim lebiat mayim. It's not absolutely, and don't take this too literally, it's not absolutely necessary to have water go into all of the creases, okay? But certainly the place where we do think halakha l'maaseh like this is it's not necessary for the water to go into the beit hastarim, things that are closed, right? Inside your ear, inside your nose, inside your mouth. Einan tzrichim lebiat mayim. You don't need water in them. So why do you have to make sure that you've washed them off and they're free of any chatzitza? So the Gemara says, Nahid biat mayim lo ba'inan. It's true that we don't need water to actually go into your mouth, your nose, your ear. But makom haro'e lebiat mayim ba'inan. We need it to be a place where the water could go in and have no chatzitza to contend with, no foreign object to contend with. Kids Rabbi Zera, as Rabbi Zera says, Da'amar Rabbi Zera, as Rabbi Zera says, Kol harai labila, as long as there is a viability of mixing, ein bila ma'akevet bo, the mixing is not strictly necessary. V'she'ein roi labila, if it's not viable for mixing, bila ma'akevet bo, then actually mixing is strictly necessary, and if you don't do it, you've undermined the whole situation. So likewise, can't have any chatzitzot in my mouth, even though water's not coming in. My mouth has to be ra'oi. It has to be fitting, viable to be able to have water contacted inside, even though I don't actually have to do that, right? Now, it's very interesting because you already see that in a situation of belila, of mixing, lechatchila, you're supposed to mix. Whereas in a situation of tevila, there's no lechatchila that you have to actually open your mouth for the water. So it's not always exactly the same, but the concept of viable is good enough. And on the flip side, it's not just viable is good enough, it's viable is necessary, right? That's what these share. So I want to give another example where this comes up. It doesn't come up in the Gemara, but it comes up in the Rishonim, is because there are other places in the Gemara where this comes up. For example, somebody who is giving bikurim, is giving first fruits misafek, meaning out of doubt, right? Where they can't do the mikra bikurim, they can't do the declaration of the bikurim. Is that a problem, right? Because it's not ra'ui for the mikra bikurim because it's just from safek. Is that a problem? Yes, it's true that mikra bikurim is not always strictly necessary. Somebody who's a ger, for example, doesn't do mikra bikurim. But if you actually should be doing it, if it really is bikurim, but you're not going to do it because we're not sure it's viable to be able to say the mikra bikurim, right? So the Gemara there says, okay, but it's just psukim. No, but it'll throw people off and they'll, right? So maybe you can't do it. Or for example, if somebody's doing chalitza, right? Situation where, God forbid, a woman hasn't, her husband dies, God forbid, they haven't had any children. There's a brother who's an adult who has to let her out of the possibility of yibum, right? So chalitza, there has to be a kriya, there has to be a declaration. What if there's muteness in the situation? What if the person is mute and they can't make the declaration, right? There's no viability, can't make the declaration, right? Or the Torah talks about a husband being mayfair his wife's nidarim, invalidating his wife's nidarim. Now, I just want to say, I wouldn't recommend it, gentlemen. I wouldn't recommend it, right? A husband be mayfair. He has to hear the neder in order to be mayfair. What if somebody can't hear, right? He knows his wife made the net, but he can't hear. Not roi labila, right? Meaning not viable to hear it, right? Does he have to be viable to hear it? So this is an example that comes up in the Rishonim, not in the Gemara itself. I just thought it would be an interesting example for people to know, what do you do when Tisha B'Av falls on Motzei Shabbat? When do you say Havdalah? Right, so say Havdalah in Tefillah, but when do you say Havdalah, like actual, like fuller Havdalah, Halakos? Like when do you say Havdalah? So for those who can think back and remember what they do, you say it Sunday night at the end of the fast. You say it Sunday night, right? So that's how the Balei Tosfot rule in Pesachim, and that's how the Shulchan Aruch rules. Uvetisha b'av shechal liot b'mitzvei Shabbat nami regilin lahavdil achar hatanit v'chein b'seder Rav Amram Gon. We found it in the Seder. Rav Amram Gon is like one of the earliest Sidurim we have, a Gaonic Siddur Kilo, and Seder Rav Amram Gon even says if Tisha B'Av it falls on a Saturday night, you'd make the proper Havdalah after the Tanit is over, okay? Now, that wasn't everybody's opinion, however. The Ramban makes a very interesting suggestion, right? That you shouldn't make Havdalah at all. Not Saturday night, not Sunday night, not the rest of the week. Ve'elu divrei Ramban zal. This is what the Ramban says. Va'adrabba, if chamistabra, he says, I think it's the opposite. The fact that you're not allowed to eat on Motzei Shabbat. Ve'lo chazila avdule b'chad b'shaba. You're and you can't make Havdalah on Sunday, right? Because it's Tisha B'Av, meaning you're not going to make it al hakos. It's Tisha B'Av. Lo mavdil b'trei b'Shabbat. You shouldn't be making it on Monday either, meaning Sunday night. Why? Tehalo chazi b'shate la'avdule. Okay. It's at the time when Havdalah was supposed to be said, it was lo ra'ui. It was not viable to say it, right? It's not that you forgot Havdalah Saturday night, so you say it Sunday morning. It's not that you forgot Havdalah somehow all day Sunday, so you say it on Monday, right? We know we can say Havdalah through Tuesday. But the point is, you didn't forget it's lo ra'ui. It wasn't viable to say it on Saturday night or Sunday because you were fasting. You were not allowed to drink a cup of wine or grape juice or Chemer Medina, right? Or, drink of the land, if you don't have those. Utfei ikalamemar, you could even say, even somebody who would say, you can make Havdalah all week. Hani mile, they would say, that's only Shabbat chazia le'avdule. That's only if on Motzei Shabbos it was viable for you to make Havdalah. Aval heichad Motzei Shabbat lo chazile lo ma'avdil below zimne. Where Motzei Shabbat is not a time where it's viable for you to make Havdalah al hakos, like a fast day, you shouldn't make Havdalah any other time either. Mishum kol haroi lebila ein bila ma'akevet bo. Because of the principle of, well, if it's viable to mix, you don't have to mix. But v'kel she'ein haroi lebila bila ma'akevet bo. And if it's not viable, then you do need to mix, meaning it can't be done. The korban mincha is puzzle, psula. Here he's saying he's activating that for the question of Havdalah, saying if you can't make Havdalah at the time because of a viability problem, it's a problem mine ube in and of itself, Havdalah is gone. You've lost it. It's gone for the week. That's it. Right? It doesn't exist. You would need to have done it on Saturday night because it wasn't viable to do it Saturday night. The same way you would have need to have mixed the 61, because it isn't viable, it becomes ma'akev. It needs to have been done on Saturday night, even though usually it doesn't have to, maybe b'diavad, you don't have to do it Saturday night, b'diavad, right? But if it wasn't viable to be done Saturday night because it was Tisha B'Av, then suddenly if you didn't do it Saturday night, it's nothing, right? So this is really, really interesting because it's not talking about invalid Havdalah. It's saying Havdalah no longer exists, right, for that week. Now, we do not paskin that way, Halakha. We do not. I want to take a few minutes to understand a little bit about the logic behind this concept of kol haroi lebila ein bila ma'akevet ba. So I want to start with Tosfot. First of all, I think Tosfot go very much into just the psukim, right? Tosfot on Menachot Yud Chet Amud Bet V'im Tomar. And if you ask, Minale deliboy roi lebila me'achar debila lo ma'akva. Why would you say that you need it to be viable for mixing if we also paskin that you don't b'diavad have to mix it? V'yesh lomar, and here's an answer. Svara bi'almahu, it's logic that kevan dekatav rachmana bila, because the Torah says bila, right? It's a mincha belula, a mixed mincha. Dini bai l'chol ha'pachot roi lebila. It teaches us that at the very least, we need, it to be viable for mixing. The fact that the word blula is in there means you can't consider mixing completely irrelevant. At the very least, even if the mixing itself is not ma'akev, is not strictly required, b'diavad, you need it to be, afilu b'diavad, you need it to be something that is viable to be mixed. And likewise, say the Balei Tosfot, v'chein legabe kriya de chalitza, likewise regarding being able to say the statement of chalitza, you need it because it's the kriya is mentioned in the psukim. V'gam kriya de bikurim, and likewise the declaration of giving first fruits. De b'chol hanu mighty to Rabbi Zera. In all those cases, Rabbi Zera is listed. And then he goes on to talk about, the situation of mikvah and how we learn it from mikvah and whether it's so easy to learn it from mikvah. But fine, that's its own problem. So what he does is he basically says, okay, it's kind of in the psukim. But I think the Rashbam in Bava Batra, which is one of the places where Kol Harai Labila shows up, the Rashbam gives us a little bit more of an insight into, what do you mean it's mentioned in the pasuk and therefore it matters? The Rashbam makes a distinction between the primary aspects of a mitzvah, or the general foundation aspect of a mitzvah, and the secondary aspects, the sub aspects of a mitzvah. And he says as follows: Mashi'i afshar lihibalel ma'akevet bo, the fact that it cannot be mixed if it's more than 60 in the vessel ends up undermining the korban mincha. Dekevan dichtiv yatzak al hashemen v'tziva livlol dichtiv belula, because the Torah says, and you shall pour on it oil, and it commands to mix, as it's described that it is mixed. Shema mina shetzivah HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahavi mincha sheyachol lekayem behen mitzvat belila. It teaches you that God is commanding that the mincha has to be something that could possibly have belila done. Ukshehu mevi 61 mincha kazo lo tziva lahavi. That's not the kind of mincha. 61 is not the kind of mincha that God commanded to bring. You might as well have brought legumes instead of, the flour that you brought. You might as well have brought legumes. De'ena klum, right? It's a nothing. Shekol davar shetzivah HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahavi, yesh ikuv be'ikar hava'ato lahavi bo'to inyan shetzivah HaKatuv. Because anything that God commands, you have to, generally speaking, bring something that can, in theory, achieve that command, right? V'lo b'inyan acher, and not something else. Aval mitzvot ha'amurot be'ota mitzvah, but the sub-mitzvot within a given mitzvah, kigon, like tnufa b'korban, waving of a korban, right? Or belila b'mincha, or actually mixing the korban mincha, the flour and the oil. Yeshe ma'akvin, some of those things are going to actually be strictly required. Im gila hakatuv l'shanot alav. For instance, if scripture, repeats it to teach you la'akev that it's strictly required. V'yeshe ma'akvin, and others are not, right? Others are not going to be strictly required. Meaning the Rashbam is basically saying, look, we have to define the item. The item or the process has to be defined in some general way that meets the criteria of what the psukim say. Then, when you get into the actual details of doing the subcategories, okay, then maybe it's something else and it's not going to necessarily be ma'akev. But when the Torah calls it a mincha belula, the foundational concept is that you have to have a mincha that can be mixed. If not, you might as well have brought a hot dog, right? It's just not the same thing. Now, the Or Sameach says something, Rav Meir Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk, he says something a little bit different when he's talking about the Rambam, because he says, well, you don't always, not everything has this concept of kol haro'i lebila apply to it. And says, for example, Ulam, and I'm only reading part of it for time, but read the rest of it on your own. Ulam be'emed kasher ta'ayin b'chol Talmud. When you look throughout the Gemara, meaning throughout Shas, lo timsa hach dekol she'ein haro'i l'bila in bila ma'akevet bo, ella, you're only going to find this concept applied, dafka hechi shehadavar ra'ui lehasot, by liyot terem gemar hadavar ha'ma'akevet. You're only going to find it applying to things that happen before the central activity that is required happens. Ukamo bila gabi mincha, like mixing the mincha. Shehablila naseit b'mincha terem haktarat kometz hamatira. The blila, the mixing, is done before you burn the little kmitza, the little part that you take out of it, which is what allows it to be eaten. Meaning, it's before the actual essence of the mitzvah has been done, right? And then he gives a bunch of other examples. And therefore he says, and again, for time, I'm telling you this, he says, if you have something that's supposed to happen before the mitzvah, for example, a declaration that happens before chalitza, that it has to be roy labila. It has to be that it's viable to happen. So for example, if somebody's mute, we're going to have to figure out, we may have a chalitza problem, an inability to do chalitza, because the action that comes even before, or simultaneous with the removal of the shoe ceremony, which is the essence of the whole thing, if you can't have that be viable, then we're going to have a problem. But what about an action that comes afterwards, such as the woman spitting? The Torah says that the woman spits bifnei, in the face of, meaning in the sight of, is the way that we're going to describe it, in the sight of her brother-in-law who's not going to marry her. What if he can't see? What if he can't see? Is that ma'akiv? Is that an issue? Do we say kol haro'i lebila there? Now, I'm not talking halakha l'masa, how people deal with those cases. It's a different story, but I'm talking on the theoretical level. And what the Or Sameach suggests is that there's a difference between the spitting afterwards, which is really sort of the aftermath of the main event, the removal of the shoe, versus the declaration beforehand. And that you don't always, kol haro'i lebila is actually, it matters where it sits in the process. Is it a footnote? Or is it kind of the lead up to the main event? And so for the Or Sameach, rather than thinking about, kol haro'i lebila as focused on, is this object viable, right? Or is it, as if you had given a peanut butter sandwich and has nothing to do with anything? He focuses on certain parts of the process have to be viable in a different way than other parts of the process, right? So are we talking about the item itself, or are we talking about the process? But overall, what I think is just incredible about this concept is it's really trying to get at a less technical way of looking, I think, at these halachot, and basically trying to take a step back and say, hey, it's not just a question of whether it's ma'akev or not ma'akev. It's not just a question of whether you have to do the blila or you don't have to do the blila. It's actually a question of whether we can define this whole thing as possibly being carried out the way that the Torah describes. So I hope this gave people insight into a klal that comes throughout Shas, and can't wait to learn with you next time.